The ER was packed. Alarms blared. The scent of antiseptic clashed with the copper tang of blood in the air. Another Friday night and another overflow of patients pushing the limits of the hospital's triage system. But for Julia Keene, it was just another shift. Nurse Keene wasn't flashy. She didn't crack jokes with the interns. She didn't gossip at the nurses' station. She moved like a ghost, efficient, precise, invisible. Most nights, you barely noticed her unless she was stitching you back together or shoving a crash cart toward a coding patient. She'd worked the night shift at Westbridge Regional Medical Center for almost 4 years. No social media, no family listed on her employee profile. She drove a 10-year-old sedan, brought the same plain lunch every night, and signed her notes with just J. Keene. But if you asked the ER docs, they'd tell you, when things got bad, really bad, Julia was who you wanted in the room. No one knew where she came from. Some said she was military. Some thought she'd lost someone in a war and left that world behind. Others just figured she was one of those trauma junkies who ran toward chaos because it was quieter than whatever was in their head. At 2:16 a.m., the double doors to Trauma 2 banged open. A paramedic shouted through the noise, "Incoming cardiac, unresponsive, no ID yet, late 60s, male, collapsed outside the base perimeter." Julia had already moved. The others were still reacting when she grabbed gloves, repositioned the gurney, and checked for breath sounds. She wasn't assigned to Trauma 2 that night, but that never stopped her. "Vitals crashing," the medic warned. "You want the code cart?" "No," Julia said quietly. "I want epinephrine, now." The room swarmed with movement. Hands flew over monitors. IVs were jammed in. But Julia's focus locked on to the man on the table. His skin was gray, but his build was unmistakable. Military. Even unconscious, his jaw was set like stone, his hands calloused, his knuckles scarred. Then she saw it. On his inner forearm, tucked just under the rolled sleeve of his collared shirt, was a small tattoo. Faded, almost rubbed out by time, but she knew it. A Medal of Honor wreath flanked by oak leaves. Julia froze for half a second, just one, but long enough for Dr. Noon to glance at her. "You all right, Keene?" She didn't answer. She was already reaching for the defibrillator. "Charging to 200. The ER techs looked on. Something about the way she moved had shifted.
The quiet nurse was in command, not just acting on training, leading like someone who had done this under fire, with gunshots ringing nearby and minutes ticking like heartbeats. "Clear!" The general's body jolted. Monitor screamed back into rhythm. Pulse. Weak, but there. Julia didn't flinch. She leaned in close and whispered something in the man's ear that no one else could hear. Seconds passed. His eyes fluttered. He was coming back. "Vital stabilizing," someone called out. Dr. Yuen looked stunned. That shouldn't have worked that fast. Julia stepped back, gloves slick with adrenaline. The moment passed, but something in the air had changed. The general, though still unnamed, had gripped her wrist, weakly, but intentionally. His mouth moved. One word. "Keene." Half the room froze. "How the hell does he know your name?" a nurse asked. Julia didn't answer. She just quietly pulled her arm away, and in doing so, her left sleeve lifted just enough for the edge of an inked trident, barely visible, to catch the light. Someone gasped. The room was still echoing with beeps and murmurs when Julia rolled down her sleeve, casually, almost instinctively, but not fast enough. The sharp-eyed nurse, Elena, had already seen it, and she wasn't the only one. Was that a Navy thing?" one of the interns asked, trying to sound casual. Julia didn't respond. She was already disinfecting the area, prepping the patient for CT. But the energy had shifted. Where moments before there was only chaos, now there was tension, curiosity, mixed with reverence, the kind that hangs in the air like smoke after a detonation. Dr. Yuen approached her slowly. He wasn't the type to pry, but something in his voice changed. Julia, that man knew your name before he even regained full consciousness. She didn't look up. People say strange things when they're crashing. But he didn't say anything else, just that, just Keene. Julia paused, gloves frozen mid-removal. Yuen continued. That tattoo, you were Navy? Once. A long time ago. That should have been the end of it, but whispers don't obey silence. By morning rounds, the story had already spread beyond the ER. Someone in radiology heard she'd stabilized a patient in half the expected time. A surgical nurse mentioned her speed with defibrillators, and someone in records swore that the man she had saved, though officially listed as John Doe, matched the description of a retired two-star general from Pendleton who'd vanished from public appearances 2 years prior.
In the staff break room, two young residents traded theories over stale coffee. Did you see how calm she was? I mean, I've never seen anyone take over a code like that. I've heard about her. Keene. Doesn't talk much, never takes extra shifts, never asks for anything. You know what that means? What? She's seen things. Combat things. The phrase stuck. Combat things. Down in ICU, the man she saved lay sedated but stable. He was no longer anonymous. Hospital admin finally confirmed his identity through military medical scans, and when the news came down, even seasoned staff went silent. Major General Thomas W. Halverson. 2 combat tours, Silver Star, Bronze with Valor. Last known duty, classified advisor on foreign operations. And the only name he'd said in the ER was Keene. The hospital director was already scrambling. Military protocols were vague on these matters, but one thing was clear. A general had collapsed on civilian soil, and a civilian nurse had performed what could only be described as combat tier triage. Back on the ER floor, Julia was trying to blend back into the blur of patient charts and paperwork, but eyes kept landing on her. The security officer from the night shift walked in, asking for her quietly. "Miss Keene, there's a military attaché asking for you." He didn't give a name, just said, quote, "She'll know who I am." Julia's eyes narrowed. She walked into the small consultation room where a man in civilian clothing stood. Gray hair, clean posture, eyes sharp as broken glass. "You were late," she said flatly. He smiled. "I thought you left this world." "I did." "Funny. You left, but you kept the trident." Julia didn't answer. The man stepped closer. He wasn't threatening, but the tension between them could have cut steel. "You understand what's happening, right? Halverson called for you. Used your name. People are starting to connect dots. I didn't ask for this. You never do. This isn't some reunion. I'm a nurse now." The man's smile faded. "You're more than that. You always were." And he remembers. She looked down, her voice low. "I stabilized him. That's all." "No. You saved him. Again. Just like Fallujah." The room went cold. She hadn't heard that name in years. Not from anyone. Not even in passing. Fallujah wasn't on her resume. It wasn't in her discharge papers.
It wasn't anywhere, except the memory of the man she just pulled back from the edge of death. And now, someone else knew. By the end of the next shift, Julia Keene was no longer just a name on the ER schedule. She was a rumor, a question no one had the courage to ask aloud. Some called her Ghost Nurse. Others whispered about the woman the general knew. But no one dared confront her directly. Not even Dr. Nguyen, who now watched her differently. Not with suspicion, with awe. What no one knew, what no one could know,
was that Julia Keene hadn't just served, she had led. 10 years ago, Fallujah. Her name was never on the official mission briefing. The file was sealed under a code name, Operation Ghost Veil. The unit, Joint Special Operations, Navy SEAL Task Force 17. She was the team's combat trauma specialist, but unlike standard medics, she was also a field-verified Tier 1 sniper, one of only 3 women cleared for that level of dual deployment. The mission was surgical: extract a hostage unit under siege from a compound surrounded by IED corridors and sniper nests. Intelligence said the area was impenetrable. They were wrong. The night sky over Fallujah was burning when it happened. Their medic went down. 2 teammates bled out before reinforcements could even breach the perimeter. And when the command line fractured under chaos, someone had to step forward. Julia stepped forward. She carried the wounded herself, applied pressure with one hand while returning fire with the other. The last man out, the one with a sucking chest wound, collapsed lung, broken femur, was Major General Thomas Halverson, then just a colonel. She kept him alive with improvised needle decompression, field gauze, and sheer will. When the chopper landed, Halverson couldn't even speak, but he grabbed her wrist as they loaded him in, just like he did in the ER a decade later. The world never knew what happened that night. The extraction was marked classified and buried beneath 5 layers of operational silence. The survivors were quietly retired. The honors never presented. The scars never counted. Julia left the military 6 months later, not because she couldn't serve, but because the silence became unbearable. Back at Westbridge, Julia stood alone in the nurse's locker room. The fluorescent light flickered overhead. She pulled off her scrub top, revealing a compression shirt underneath. As she reached for her clean uniform, her sleeve slid again.
This time, the full trident showed, with 2 bars inked beneath it, a mark reserved only for those with multi-theater combat clearances. Most SEALs didn't even know it existed. Behind her, a voice spoke. "I thought that was you." She turned. It was Dr. Rhea Coldwell, Westbridge's trauma surgeon. Late 50s, stern, decorated, rumored to have worked with military surgeons in Baghdad, but she never spoke about it. Julia tensed. "Didn't think you'd remember." "I don't forget people who stabilized 3 of my soldiers under mortar fire," Caldwell said. "You were barely 23. Julia looked down. "That was another life." "No," Caldwell said gently. "That was your real one. This is the cover." Julia didn't argue. Caldwell stepped closer, her voice low. "The general's awake, asking for you." Room 408 was cordoned off by hospital security, but when Julia walked in, the guards stepped aside. No one told them to. Something in their posture, some instinctive recognition, made them move. Inside, General Halverson lay propped on pillows, IV lines snaking from his arms, but his eyes were sharp, clear, alert. He smiled when he saw her. "You never lost your edge." "You always did like collapsing dramatically," she said, her voice flat, but tinged with dry warmth. He chuckled, wincing. "You saved me again. I didn't do anything different than I did 10 years ago." Halverson turned serious. "You saved more than me. You kept a unit alive that night, and I never got to say thank you. I wasn't supposed to." "Damn politics," he muttered. "They buried you. I watched them do it." Julia folded her arms. "I let them." "Why?" She looked out the window. The city lights flickered beneath the night sky, silent and uncaring. Halverson studied her. "You deserve more than this. I have enough." There was a long silence.
Then the general spoke words Julia hadn't expected. "They're coming, you know." "Who?" "Pentagon Liaison Office. They know you're here. Your file's been accessed by people who don't want ghosts walking among civilians." Julia's breath caught, just for a second. "I didn't ask to be found. That doesn't matter anymore." By sunrise, the hospital was no longer just a place of healing. It had become a pressure chamber. A low-level DoD liaison arrived first, unannounced. He wore no uniform, carried no weapon, but his ID badge hummed with silent authority.
He asked no questions at the front desk, just showed a name, Julia Keene. Then came two more, one from Veterans Affairs, one from a logistics division no one had heard of, Office of Operational Integration, whatever that meant. The whispers in the halls grew louder. Someone swore they saw men in suits outside the cafeteria. Someone else claimed a floor nurse had been quietly reassigned. Dr. Nguyen just kept staring at Julia's chart in the break room, hands shaking slightly. "Why didn't I know?" he muttered aloud. "How does someone like that end up in this ER?" By 9:15 a.m., the first reporter called. Then another. Then a flood. Someone had leaked a tip. Decorated Navy SEAL working as a nurse in California hospital under alias, connected to classified mission, witnessed saving retired general's life. Hospital PR scrambled. They had no press statement, no prepared talking points, just fear and a name they weren't sure they were even allowed to say aloud. Julia had finished her shift an hour ago. She was in the back hallway, locker half closed, bag slung over her shoulder, when a security officer intercepted her. "They want you in the director's office, now." She didn't ask who they were, she already knew. Inside, the director sat pale-faced behind a cluttered desk. Next to him stood a woman in her 50s, stiff posture, severe haircut, eyes like glass. She wore civilian clothes, but everything about her screamed military. "Ms. Keene," she said, not offering a hand. "We need to talk." Julia remained standing. "We've reviewed the circumstances surrounding your presence here. Unregistered background, no official re-entry into federal systems. Yet you used techniques and decision-making consistent with Tier 1 combat medics." "I stabilized a coding patient," Julia replied calmly. "That's what I'm paid to do." The woman didn't blink. "You performed a midline decompression blind, used a 2-second shock cadence only taught in combat medicine rotations, and somehow General Halverson, a man who hasn't spoken your name in 10 years, woke up and immediately asked for you." Silence. Then, "Are you denying your identity?" Julia tilted her head slightly. "If I do, will you leave?" "No. But if you admit it, we may be able to control the narrative." Julia laughed once, soft, bitter. "You've never controlled my narrative. Not then, not now." The woman took a step forward. "Miss Keene, you are listed in a sealed file marked voluntarily retired under duress."
That file was never supposed to be touched again, and now it's been opened because of you. "I didn't want this," Julia said sharply. "You people buried me. After all I gave, after what I lost, you erased me." "Because you became a liability," the woman said, without flinching. "Fallujah made you a myth. We don't manage myths, we bury them." Julia stepped forward now, voice like steel. "I buried 6 teammates. You buried me. The difference is, I remember their names." That shut the room down. The director quietly slid a file folder toward her. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Reactivation request. DoD. Clearance reinstatement. Subject. Keene, Julia. Status. Pending. Voluntary approval. Julia stared at it for a long time. Then closed the folder. No. By noon, the hospital had been swarmed. News vans outside, helicopters above, soldiers quietly standing near side entrances. Inside, the energy was surreal. Patients whispered. Nurses stared, and everywhere she walked, people parted, some in fear, some in reverence, some in shame. Elena, the same nurse who had once gossiped about Julia's silence, stepped into her path with trembling hands. We didn't know." Julia didn't answer, but her eyes softened. For a moment. "You never asked." In the lobby, something impossible happened. The general walked. He shouldn't have. He'd been discharged less than 24 hours prior, but with help from a cane and 2 uniformed escorts, he stood before the gathered hospital staff, nurses, janitors, volunteers, paramedics. He looked at Julia. "This woman saved my life twice, once under fire, once under fluorescent lights, and both times I would have died without her." He turned to the others. "You didn't know who she was because she never told you, because that's who she is. She doesn't talk about what she did. She carries it." He saluted her, and one by one, every military veteran in the building followed. ER nurses, orderlies, even a janitor no one had ever known was former Army. The entire hospital stood still. Julia didn't move, but her hand slowly rose, palm to temple, a return salute. No words, just silence and honor. That night, Julia didn't sleep. She didn't turn on the news, though she knew she was the headline. She didn't answer the phone, though it rang dozens of times. And she didn't open the laptop in her kitchen drawer, though she knew the emails waiting inside bore subject lines like urgent, White House statement pending, request for joint military interview, DOJ clearance update required, 60 minutes production inquiry. All of it was noise. The world had taken her silence and made it into a spectacle. Downstairs, her building's doorman, Mr. Pena, a Korean war vet in his 80s, handed her a folded piece of paper when she went out for air. "Some guy left this for you. Said you'd understand." The note was handwritten, tight, block lettering, military. "Some debts can't be paid, only honored. You walk alone so we can walk free. We remember. D." There was no signature, but Julia knew who D was. Captain Ray Dobbins, once her direct report, now a battalion commander in Quantico. She hadn't seen him since Bagram, since the night she'd taken a bullet meant for him. She folded the note quietly and placed it in her coat pocket, right beside the trident, still warm from her palm. By morning, the hospital's parking lot was a war zone of another kind. Reporters, drones, protesters, supporters holding signs that read, "Honor her," and "Real heroes don't brag." Julia slipped in through the ambulance entrance, back to her shift. But even the ER felt different now. Some staff called her ma'am without realizing it. The med students flinched when she walked by. A few older nurses cried when they saw her, as if realizing for the first time what they'd been working beside all these years. At noon, the hospital director called her into a meeting. This time, the room was full. Not just the director and the federal liaison, but a full media relations team, military uniformed officers, legal counsel, even someone from Homeland Security. The moment she walked in, the room fell quiet. "Miss Keene," said the woman from the Pentagon, "we want to formally offer you reinstatement. Active advisory role. Public-facing if you're willing, private if you're not." Julia didn't answer. "Your story, it means something right now. In this climate, we need someone like you. Not for the medals, for the reminder." Still, she was silent. Then a final voice spoke up. The man from Homeland Security. "We're not asking you to serve again. You already did. We're just asking you to speak, to let people know what service really looks like." Julia looked down at her hands, scarred, weathered, steady.
Hands that had saved lives, pulled triggers, held friends as they bled out. Hands that had washed blood from floors in silence.
Stitched strangers' wounds under flickering lights. Hands that had saluted 6 coffins and hadn't saluted since, until yesterday. "Do you want to be seen?" the woman finally asked. "Or do you want to disappear again?" Julia looked up. "I don't want either." That puzzled everyone. "I want to be heard. Once. Properly. Then I want to go back to work." 2 days later, Julia Keene stood in front of a podium at the Naval Medical Center San Diego. The crowd was standing room only. Veterans in the front row, med students in the back, journalists packed shoulder to shoulder with active duty officers. She stepped to the mic, took a breath. "I was never supposed to be a hero. I didn't enlist for glory. I enlisted because I believed in something. Because someone once told me that quiet courage saves more lives than loud power ever will." Silence. "I didn't come here to relive war stories. I came to remind you that some of the strongest people you'll ever meet won't look strong, won't talk about what they did, won't demand your respect, but they've earned it. I was buried once, politically, socially, professionally, and I let it happen, because I believed I'd done my part, that the world didn't need to hear from me again. But then I realized silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's a cage. So today I speak." She paused, looked down at the trident pinned to the inside hem of her jacket, half visible, half hidden. "And tomorrow I go back to work." She stepped away from the podium, and the entire room rose, not in applause, but in salute. Every veteran, every nurse, every officer, every stranger. Julia didn't cry, but something in her shifted. 6 months later, the news cycle had moved on, the interviews had ended, the speaking offers faded, and Julia Keene had returned to the ER, not to headlines, not to parades, just to patients. She still parked in the same far corner of the hospital lot, still packed her own meals, still wrote her patient notes by hand. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed, but to those who watched closely, everything had. New nurses entering the department no longer rolled their eyes at silence. They paid attention to the ones who moved quietly, listened first, acted with care. They'd heard the story, maybe not all the details, but enough to understand that sometimes the one who stands furthest from the spotlight casts the longest shadow. Medical residents started asking for Julia's mentorship.
Not because of her rank, but because she taught calm in the middle of chaos. Because her voice never rose, but when it did, people listened. "Vitals are data. Your instincts are wisdom," she'd say. "Trust both, but act with your hands, not your fear." One morning, a new paramedic rushed through the ER entrance with a trauma victim, chest wound, hypotensive, barely breathing. The attending doctor shimmied for supplies. The room spun into motion. But Julia didn't rush. She walked to the table. One look, and she had already seen the bleed. One touch, and she knew where the edge of death lay. She slid in a chest tube in 3 moves, checked pressure, repositioned the gurney, stabilized vitals before anyone else had even realized what was wrong. When the patient was wheeled away, the young EMT turned to the others. She just knew. An older nurse smiled. She always knows. After the shift, Julia passed by the memorial wall in the West Corridor. Originally a small plaque for hospital donors, it had recently been expanded to honor fallen medical staff
and veterans who'd served under extreme circumstances. At the very bottom, in brushed steel, a new inscription had been added. True strength doesn't speak loud. It simply shows up, again and again, in honor of J.K. No one had told her about it. No one had asked for permission. But someone, maybe a nurse, maybe a patient, had decided that silence deserves recognition too. That evening, Julia sat on the rooftop of the hospital, legs crossed, watching the sun drop behind the city. The wind pulled gently at her hair. In her lap, a small stack of letters. Not fan mail, not press inquiries, just short, handwritten notes. From veterans, from trauma survivors, from young nurses who wrote, "Thank you for showing us what quiet leadership looks like." She folded the letters and placed them in her worn canvas bag. Then, from her coat pocket, she pulled out a small silver object, the trident, not pinned, not displayed, just held between her fingers. Then, after a pause, she slipped it into a metal box marked Personnel Effects, Julia Keene. She locked the box, slid it under her chair, and whispered to no one in particular, "I don't need to carry it anymore, but I'll always remember how it carried me." The screen fades to black. Then, slowly, a single sentence appears. Some heroes return to war, others return to work, and some return to silence.